I'm a kick-off Aoife. That's right, and John. Yeah. So yeah, look, I'd like to just turn 12 o'clock there, and we've I think over tipping over 40 participants after joining the webinar, so we might just kick off. That's okay with you. So my name is Gry Hurley. I'm the regional manager of Teagasc Cork West. I would just like to welcome you all here today on this webinar that's focusing on solar energy on farms. So I'd first like to thank the organisers of this event, Aoife Healy from Carbery, and also my colleague John McNamara. So thank you both for organising this event. So we have two very excellent speakers that will speak on the webinar today, and I'm going to let the chairperson Aoife Healy introduce them and give you background on those before we kick off. Just all I'd like to say really, I suppose, is that farmers have always been evolving and improving their businesses over the years. And there's been a lot of interest we've seen on solar energy and farms that we meet between discussion groups that are on the ground. There's been a lot of interest about solar energy. So again, this is what we drew up this webinar here for today. Look, sustainability, I think it's been a word that we've hear more and more about, but I think it's something that farmers have been very sustainable on their farms, over the years, and farmers, have always been willing to grasp any challenge ahead. And I think again we've seen that farmers are very proactive in this area of agriculture. So again, I think it's very positive to see this, and it's very positive to see this on a lot of rooftops as well. As we drive through the countryside as well, it's a good positive message we're seeing. So look, without further ado, I'll pass you on to the chairperson, Aoife Healy of Carbery. Look, I hope that this webinar will encourage any farmers out there to adopt solar energy on their farms or to answer any questions that they may have on the system. So I suppose, look, at just one last thing first. I suppose just if you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can just pop them down into the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Aoife will probably keep track of this anyway throughout the webinar, but there's a function at the bottom of your screen there. You can click on chat and then put your questions in throughout the presentations, and both Aoife and John will pick up that. So over to you, Aoife. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Grania, and I think Grania has covered the welcome very well there. But just on behalf of Carbery, I'd like to thank you and welcome you to the webinar this morning, which I hope you'll find very informative. I just want to make you aware the webinar is being recorded, and as Grania said, to put the questions into the chat box, and we'll address them as we go on through the webinar. So this morning, we're very thankful to our two speakers, John Upton from Teagasc Moore Park and Kevin Murphy from KM Agri Consulting. John is a specialist in renewable energy, and he's going to go through what we should be looking for as farmers looking to install solar on our farms. And Kevin Murphy is going to look at the practical side of actually applying for a TAMS application for solar power. So I think at that, I'm going to hand you straight over to John Upton to get into the ins and outs of solar on our farms.
Can I interject? Sorry, this is John McNamara. Can you do any questions and answers in the question and answer box at the bottom, because we lose it in chat? So please type in your questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen rather than the chat. Sorry about that, everybody.
Thank you for clarifying. Thanks, John.
Grand, John. Thanks for taking control of things. Thanks to the organisers as well for setting this up, to Carbery and to John McNamara as well. I'm delighted to give you an update this morning on the solar energy opportunities for dairy farms. I suppose there's been a lot of changes in the space over the last few months, so it's important to kind of give an update on that and explain what those changes are and how they would affect your decision making around this topic. I'll do the first piece on it. I'll hand over to Kevin Murphy then to discuss the TAMS, and then I'll finish up with some information on paybacks and that. So this is the contents of the presentation. First, I'll just refresh your memory in terms of the current energy costs of producing milk on farms. I'll briefly touch on energy efficiency. This isn't an energy efficiency talk today, but we'll mention the important points that are still relevant there. We'll look into the solar technology in terms of what it comprises of and so on. We'll give an update on the planning situation. We look at the current state of affairs with export tariffs, and that leads on to grid connections. And then finally, we'll give the details there in relation to the solar capital investment scheme which is the new Thames Solar Scheme, or SCIS for short. So without delaying any further, we'll move on here now to the current energy costs of producing milk. And as you know, electricity unit rates have increased dramatically over the last 12 months. We're currently looking at day rates approaching 40 cent and night rates around the 20 cent mark, which is obviously a massive change over where they used to be. So the current cost of producing milk, this is an average figure on Irish dairy farms, is about 12 euros per 1,000 litres of milk sold. So you'd be expecting, therefore, a bill of about 6,000 euros plus VAT on average for a 100 cow farm. The average consumption figure from my work is showing about 250 kilowatt hours of electricity consumed per cow per year. So again, just keeping things simple, if you were to look at a 100 cow farm, that you'd expect a consumption on average of about 25,000 kilowatt hours. Now, look, that excludes domestic usage. My work typically doesn't look at domestic consumption. And bear in mind that there's a massive range in terms of the energy efficiency that you'll see on a range of dairy farms. So while this figure of 25,000 represents an average, you could have some farms would be as low as 15 and others might be as high as 35, you know, just for the farm alone. So that idea of getting a handle on your own particular energy use in terms of kilowatt hour consumption per year when you're embarking on this solar journey, I suppose, is very important, because we'll see later on that dictates how you would size your system afterwards. And then if you're adding in domestic usage, so if your house is on the same meter as the farm, you can add in your domestic usage now for the purposes of sizing the Thames system. And you'd expect that to be in the order of another 5,000 units per year for an average 3-bed house. But again, there's huge variation among domestic energy use. Again, just to refresh your memory in terms of where that electricity is going, you know, the main ones are your milk cooling, your water heating, and your milking machine. We won't speak in detail on them, but they're the main ones as per my research work. Okay. Now, as I said, I won't go into energy efficiency in detail, but I will just mention a few important points in terms of reducing costs. Again, using night rate is critical to keeping costs low. You'll be aiming to use about half your electricity on night rate if you could. Benchmarking electricity suppliers every 12 months is obviously vital to maintain the best available rates. However, in the solar era, I suppose that process has become a bit more complicated, because not only now are you looking at day and night rates, you'll also be looking at export tariffs. So 6 or 7 electricity suppliers now also offer a solar export tariff. So you'd be taking that into consideration. However, my best advice on it would be to still choose your electricity supplier based on the best available day and night rates, rather than on the supplier that has the best export tariff, because we'll be buying in a lot more than we're selling out. Technology such as plate cooling, variable speeds, and heat recovery also still have an important role to play. Okay. Now we move on to the next point, which is just, I suppose, what would I call it? A crash course on the components that make up a solar PV system. PV is short for solar photovoltaics, okay? These solar panels, they're typically, I suppose, installed on the roof of a shed, and the purpose of them is simply to generate renewable electricity from the sun. Your typical components, they're comprised of a roof, ground or wall mounted panel array, and those panels will produce low voltage DC electricity when they're exposed to sunlight. That DC electricity then is converted over to mains AC electricity by a piece of equipment called an inverter. So that's the second important component of a PV system. The solar inverter then is connected up to your main fuse board on the farm, and from there it's distributed to various electrical loads, basically whatever is running, or it's exported off to the national grid if the on-site demand is below the level of generation. Additional components may include an item called a diverter, and the diverter will route excess PV generated electricity to a hot water heater in the event where there's nothing else to use it. You could also include a battery system, and the battery system's purpose is to even out supply and demand mismatches between what's supplied by the PV system and what's consumed by the farm. In terms of an overall average performance, right, we're sizing solar panels in kWps, which is a kilowatt peak. And 1 kilowatt peak of solar panels would generate 1 kilowatt hour of electricity in an hour under ideal conditions. And on average over a year, that 1 kilowatt peak of panels would produce about 950 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. So that'd be worth 380 euros at day rate. And 1 kilowatt peak takes up about 5 meters squared of roof space. So obviously, if our farm uses, if our average 100 cow farm is using 25,000 units, we're going to need a lot more than 1 kilowatt peak, but we'll come back to sizing in a minute. This slide here is designed just to illustrate what I'm talking about when I mention the supply and demand mismatches in relation to solar PV. So what we've got here on the vertical axis is energy consumption from a farm, and we've got time along the bottom horizontal axis there. Then in terms of the different color trends, we've got a rotary load profile in orange, a herringbone load profile in blue, a robot load profile in gray, and then we have our solar radiance, which would be a proxy for solar generation potential in yellow. And you can clearly see you have your spike in consumption with your herringbone and rotary farms early enough in the morning. Another spike in the evenings. Okay, it's notable that the rotary farms, in the work that I've been doing, they tend to milk a little bit earlier in the evening than the herringbone farms. Okay, and obviously they'll have a higher spike in consumption due to the bigger machinery that's running. On the other hand, then your robotic milking system would be consuming away more continuously at a lower level. Okay, but regardless of what type of milking system that's in place on the farm, you've got your peak generation potential of your PV system is between the milkings typically. Okay, so you've got I suppose a few decisions to make then at that point with this power that's being produced. You can either sell it off, you can export it at the export tariff rate, or you can turn something on here in the middle of the day while the PV system is running to consume or self-consume a little bit more. And the options there really are typically a hot water heater via the diverter, as I mentioned, or else the battery could be charged during that time. Okay. Now, I suppose, look, when you're going out to buy solar panels, it's like anything else, whether you're buying a milking machine or a car or whatever it is, they come with a suite of specifications that you should be aware of, okay? Every solar panel will have an efficiency value attached to it, and that efficiency value should be, at this point in time, at least 20% or greater. And what that means is that for every we'll say whatever, for every 1,000 watts of power that falls on a particular panel, 20% of it, or 200 watts, will be converted over to electricity. Okay, and that efficiency figure has been increasing, I suppose, slowly but steadily over the last few years, and they're at the range now of 20 to 24% typically. Okay. Now you have two different types of warranty. The first one we'll talk about is a product warranty, which covers the physical structure of the panel itself, and that should cover at least a 12-year period. Okay, and then in addition to that, they're coming with a performance warranty, and that should be at least 25 years. Some panels even come with a 30-year performance warranty, and a typical example of a warranty like that would say that the panels will produce at least 85% of their original power after 25 years. So it's a well-known property of solar panels that they degrade in performance slowly over time by about 0.5% in efficiency. So you'd expect that tail off. That's normal, but we want some certainty around what level of reduction is going to occur over the lifetime of the panel systems. And a decent solar supplier will also be able to provide you with a generation report, which would highlight how many kilowatt hours of electricity should be produced by that panel system each year up to the 25 years. There's also a good register here maintained by the SEI. It's called the EEE register. The link is there on the slide. And that register contains a list of panels that are approved for sale in Ireland. And if you intend to claim any capital allowances on the panel system, it's vital that the panels are on that EEE register. That's the panels. The other component, I suppose, that I'll just briefly mention are the batteries. Again, there's a suite of specs that goes with them. They're rated, I suppose, in terms of how many kilowatts of electricity that they can store. They're available in various sizes, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20 kilowatts in size. Their typical discharge rate is about 4 to 5 kilowatt hours. So they take, let's say you have a 20 kilowatt battery in place, it'll take 4 or 5 hours to discharge that battery completely. So even though in theory, you might have enough to do your evening milking stored in the battery, you can't dump it all out in an hour while you're milking. The batteries will contribute to your usage during milking, but it's unlikely you'll be able to run your milking completely on batteries for that reason. That discharge rate is limiting, okay? The depth of discharge as well is another one. So it's typically about 90%. So if you have a 20 kilowatt battery unit, you can withdraw about 18 kilowatts from it. There's always that 2 will be left inside. You can't discharge them completely. The design life of them is another important one. It's typically 10,000 cycles of charging and discharging, which would give you an expected lifespan of about 14 years with 2 cycles per day. Now, I shouldn't say lifespan on that, I should say warranted life. They will still continue to function after that period, albeit at a reduced capacity. In terms of sizing then for batteries in line with TAMS, right, you can size the batteries at about 0.5 kilowatts of battery storage for 1 kilowatt peak of solar panels. So if you had a 20 kilowatt solar PV system, you could install a 10 kilowatt battery along with that. Leaving that now for the moment, we'll just briefly mention the planning side of things. So again, there's huge changes in the area of planning in relation to solar panels because the government removed the requirement for planning permission for solar PV systems on the roofs of agricultural premises late last year. So rooftop solar installations covering the entire roof are exempt from requiring planning permission, which is a big positive development. Prior to that, there was a limit of 50 meters squared. There are still 43 designated solar safeguarding zones where a rooftop limit remains, and those are typically around hospitals and airports. And in those solar safeguarding zones, the limit of 50 meters squared still remains. For ground-mounted solar panels, there's a maximum area of 75 meters squared at a height of 2.5 meters permitted without planning. And for wall-mounted, it's the same at 75 meters squared. So for most typical dairy farming installations, it's fair to say that a planning permission application won't be required, although anyone close to one of those or in those solar safeguarding zones would be limited somewhat. Now, point 3 is on the export tariffs. This kind of gets a bit complicated, but we'll keep it as simple as we can. In terms of the export tariff that's available here to us, we're looking at the Clean Export Guarantee, or the CEG. And this CEG was announced by government in early 22, which requires that electricity companies pay an amount per kilowatt exported to the grid. The CEG, it's linked to the wholesale price of electricity, and it'll vary continuously according to market rates. The export tariffs currently available are considerably less than the unit rates charged for day rate electricity, about 50%. So I mentioned earlier, our day rates are around 40 cents per kilowatt hour. our export tariffs are currently ranging from 14 to 20 cent per kilowatt hour, depending on the supplier. Therefore, there's a strong incentive to size PV systems on farms predominantly for self-consumption, as this will yield the fastest payback. And a very important development there, the last point, TAM's grant-aided systems can avail of the CEG for any power that's exported out to the national grid. So that's an important component. While no one will be getting rich off the CEG, it's an important component in justifying the systems financially. Grid connections, they're another very important component of the whole process, because if you don't secure the correct grid connection, you won't be able to sell your excess electricity back. So there's two applicable schemes here for dairy farms, I think, that would be of relevance. The first one is the ESB microgeneration scheme, and that allows connection of 6 kilowatt peak on single phase installations, or 11 kilowatt peak on 3-phase. That process is a very easy, kind of hassle-free process. There's no connection fees involved, and it seems to be occurring on the ground fairly quickly. However, the downside of it is most farms will be installing larger systems than that. So that leads us on to the mini generation scheme, which is the next level up. And that allows for connection of systems up to 17. This allows for connections of inverters up to 17 kilowatt peak on single phase, or 50 kilowatt peak on 3-phase. So it's a substantial increase in capacity, although be it a little bit limiting still on the single phase. The connection fee roughly is about €1,000. There's a form that would need to be filled out by your supplier as well, and it's taking a bit of time to get that process through. You'll be allowing 3 or 4 months, I suppose, from start to finish on that, is what I'm hearing. Now, they're the limits, I suppose, the theoretical limits on the ESB side, but in reality, what you can connect to the grid is limited by the maximum import capacity of the farm as well, okay? So the maximum import capacity is the MIC that's available. It's usually printed on the bill, or you can inquire with networks directly what your MIC is. The vast majority of farms have an MIC of less than 29 kVA, even on 3-phase, because once you go over that, you're into commercial electricity rates and PSO levies and so on. So historically, for that reason, dairy farms would be 29 as a maximum, but there's a lot of farms with MICs even less than that. So your theoretical, your practical limit then, I suppose, for a single phase farm going forward is the 17 kilowatt peak as dictated by the mini generation scheme. Or if you're on 3-phase, more than likely you'll be limited here by this 29 kVA connection limit, okay? Now, it is possible to install slightly more solar panels on the roof than your inverter size is spec'd at. So we'll say if you had a 20 kilowatt, or let's say you had a 17 kVA inverter on your farm, which was connected to the grid, you could install a solar panel array of 24 or 5 kilowatts. There'd be no problem with that. Your solar installer anyway will provide further guidance on what that oversizing could be. Now, at this point, I'll hand over to Kevin just to go through some of the details of the SCIS, and I'll pop back in again then later to discuss the payback periods.
Thanks, John. There, I'll just run through a bit on TAMs there and the process of going through it, and just a few bits just to look out for when you're doing your application. The new TAMS 3 Solar Capital Investment Scheme, the SCIS, increases the grant rate on solar panels to 60% and introduces a standalone a ceiling of 90,000. Under TAMS 2 there, it was only 40% has been increased to 60. So this is a big jump, and also the ceiling has been increased from 80 to 90,000, which makes it a lot more attractive for farmers, and it's a lot better. It's a lot more attractive investment. The maximum PV system allowable has also increased from 11 kilowatts to 62 kilowatts. the reference costs have similarly been revised to y is equal to 1441 x plus 1849. The x there is just the size of the system you put in, so that's a handy little calculation for anyone there who gets spec size system, and it'll allow them to calculate how much grant they'll be able to receive from the size system they put in. So for example here, the reference cost for a 26 kilowatt peak PV system is 39,315. So that's your 1441x, or 1441 multiplied by 26 plus 1849, that'll give you your 39,315. So that'll come out at 1,512 per kilowatt peak. For batteries then, the reference cost is calculated based on the rate of storage, kilowatt hours of the proposed battery installation. The maximum size battery being granted may be no more than half the size of the panels. The reference cost for batteries is calculated as similar again as above, 703x being the size of your battery plus 753. So for above there, you have a 26 kilowatt system, you'll be allowed a 13 kilowatt battery. So your 703 plus, or 703 multiplied by 13 plus 753, that'll come out at 9,892. So that'll be your reference cost from your TAMS application. So that's handy enough calculation there, see whatever battery you get spec'd. I could just skip on to the next slide there, please, Jan.
Yeah, it's just taking a minute there. Sorry,
well, that's all right. So we can see there, it's obviously a very attractive. The 40 to 60% is a huge jump in investment there. It's nearly a 50% increase on and the reference costs have also been increased. So as John was saying there earlier, there the PV size, and that's just to ensure that you won't install a system greater than the amount of electricity that you produced last year. So the sizing guidelines will cap the generation capacity of the system of the total annual electricity consumption of the farm. For example, if a 100-cow farm consumes 25,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, the maximum PV system eligible for TAM support will be determined by the annual generation capacity of the solar modules being deployed, which can vary by supplier, geographical location and orientation. So some people there in the northwest of the country will obviously get less of a return from their panels, so they'll be able to incorporate a bigger amount of panels for their system. And the orientation, some people are more facing at east and west, so that'll also have an impact on the size of the system you'll be allowed to put in. Assuming a generation capacity of 950 kilowatt peak a year, which would be the southwest of the country, so that'd be our location. The maximum eligible PV array size for this example would be a 100-cow farm, would be 25,000 divided by 950 is equal to 26 kilowatt peak system. So if you're up in the northwest of the country there now, that'd be 25,000 by something around 700 or 800. So they'd obviously be able to put in a bigger system. This could be coupled with a battery of the 26 by a half. That's the half the PV or the battery size is your panel. So that'll give you a 13 kilowatt hour battery. Skip on there again, please, Jan. The energy survey. This is the first step. If you're decided to go down the route of a panel, just get an energy completed by the department, accepted installer. That'll be the first step. So if you decide to go down the road of solar panels, that's the first thing. You won't need to contact your advisor or anyone else first. You just get them in, get them to do your energy survey, which will be dictated by your annual, or whichever is lower, your annual consumption or your farm gate supply. So he'll give you the energy survey, and then the second thing, I suppose, is to get a farmyard layout plan off your, that's can come from your NNP, so that's handy enough. Just contact your advisor there. You can get it off Google Maps, but sometimes that isn't the best, it's hard to get a scale in Google Maps. So if you get the NNP, just mark on the map where you plan to put the investment. The detailed drawing, that hopefully should come from your the energy supplier, but if it's tricky to come across that, if you just draw out a sketch, I can't draw to scale then here. It has to be drawn to a scale of 1:100, and it has to include the dimensions of the roof edges and its location on the roof, the inverter, meter, and the batteries. A copy of your folio or stamped lease, as for all TAMS investments, a copy of your BIS application will do. But if you're leasing a farm or anything like that, you have to have at least 5 years left on your lease before you can apply for any TAMS application. TAMS grant aided systems must be a standalone. Previously you can't, that's just to make sure that you don't double claim in SEI grants or anything like that. So just to make sure that you can only claim once. Roof lights shall not be covered with panels, and on the roof lights, it might be a better idea maybe just to cover over the roof lights and maybe put your perspex sheeting on the side sheeting. it's probably a bit cheaper, but you can actually install safety cages under the roof lights if you want to go down that route. The panels, they also have to be located 0.5 meter in from all the roof edges and 15 centimeters above the roof plane. That's just to ensure, just for safety reasons, because the panels will need to be maintained, power hose and all that, just to ensure the solar providers, they keep them in 0.5 meter. And the panels can't exceed the height of the pitch of the roof, so they can't exceed over the top of the roof. No, as with any other internal or with any other TAMS investments, just to make sure there's nothing sharing the same airspace as an internal agitation point. So no internal agitation points are permitted under the TAMS applications. So you can, if there's an internal agitation point under the roof that you have, you can actually put in a farm safety just to get that extension out, just to make an external. That's also 60%, and you can put the two of them in together, so there'll be no delay. You can reapply later to increase the size of your system. So if you want to put in 10 kilowatts this year, you can and you decide in 2 years' time you want to put another 10 kilowatts, there's nothing stopping you from claiming the grant again for that, the follow-up size again, just to increase the size of your system. The first tranche is open till the 16th of June. But as John was saying there, like there's backlog, so it might be better just to try and get everything in as soon as you can and get onto the energy suppliers to get the survey done. And once the survey is done, really, it's kind of streamlined. I can get onto your advisor then for the 1:500 map, and everything else is kind of straightforward. But just to be mindful that there's a big backlog and under the new TAMS investment. So just general information under TAMS, and your spillover between the milking zone that's not used on the farms, you can claim, you can get paid for that spillover. Panels cannot be mounted on dwelling house, but it can be included in the survey. So once the dwelling house is in close proximity to the farm, you can include this usage under your TAMS survey, but you can't mount solar panels on the roof of the house. The panels can be ground or roof mounted, as John said. No planning permission required under less than safe zones. And if you're if you think you might be within 5 kilometers of an airport or a hospital or anything like that, you can go into myplan.ie and you can throw in your air code there and you can see clearly whether you're in or out. And no planning permission can be granted or no TAMS application can be submitted until you full planning permission acquired. No, as in any other TAMS investment, no hire purchase, so that everything has to be owned at time of claim. Under the first tranche, you'd be hoping to get the first approvals. We'd be hoping to have them back by mid to late August. And I'd like to thank you all for listening and hand you back to John there just to finish off. And thank you.
Perfect, Kevin. Thanks for that.
No problem.
Okay, just a couple of other supports, I suppose, that are there. We'll just briefly mention them. There's the accelerated capital allowance scheme, which is available to sole traders, where they can write the cost of the solar panels off against tax in the year of installation. I suppose the accountant, the farm accountant, would be the best person to advise on what effect that might have on a case-by-case basis, and the VAT is recoverable on them as well. We'll just kind of finish up now with the information giving, I suppose, with this example payback. So look, I'll just take it, as we said, every farm is going to be a bit different, but we'll just take the 100 cow farm, an average 100 cow farm that we were mentioning earlier, where, you know, this 26 kilowatt peak system would be suitable as what it came out as. And we'll look at the effect of the grant. So scenario 1 and 2 there would be without the grant. Scenario on 3 and 4 would be the 60% TAMS grant included. The difference between number 1 and number 2 then is the batteries. So scenario 1 and scenario 3 have no batteries, and scenario 2 and scenario 4 have that 13 kilowatt battery that we mentioned. Okay, and you can see the investment costs there obviously increase a lot when the battery is added. The annual revenue generated as a result of installing the system then increases as well if you add in the batteries, because you're self-consuming a little bit more. And the payback, we'll say, for the panels on their own without a grant is in and around 7.5 years. Now, that the paybacks here that we're talking about, they don't look at the capital allowance thing at all. Okay, that has to be worked out by the accountant afterwards, so just keep that in mind. But like 7.5 years without any grant is a lot better than it ever was, I suppose. But I guess, look, keep in mind here that when you add the batteries in, like it will increase the payback to close enough to 10 years without a grant. So we'll say in the absence of that grant scheme, the batteries would have been a fairly marginal investment. But if we come down here now to scenario 3, which is our panel system, 60% grant and no batteries, your payback is 3 years, like, which is very, very good. And when you add the batteries in, then again with the grant, the 13 kilowatt battery pack, your payback increases a small bit, but it's 4.1 years. And I would say like anything less than 5 is a fairly attractive investment typically. So from that perspective, I suppose the paybacks on these systems have never been better, and clearly the grant has a very positive effect on the overall return. Okay, and in that situation, you know, to me it makes sense to include a modest sized battery with those PV systems, provided you can get them now, because I think the availability of the batteries could be a problem for some suppliers. Okay, now the procurement side of it is tricky. You know, there's no point in saying otherwise, because it's sort of new to everyone. No one has typically, we haven't a strong history of going out to buy these things, so you're kind of starting a bit green, you know. So look, I've outlined a few key points just to keep in mind anyway that might help a bit with the process. As we mentioned earlier, like every farm, it's going to be a different solution. So you need a supplier really that's going to do a tailored assessment and develop an individual solution for your farm. I think that's the first thing. Anyone that's just trying to put on a generic thing without looking at, you know, the level of consumption of the farm, the roof space available, the grid connection capacity, the location, the roof orientation, roof slope, you know, all that stuff comes into it, and would need to be thought about prior to sort of putting a price together. The generation report, which I mentioned earlier, is very important, because that's something you can look back on after and see, is your system performing as intended, you know. And as I said, those performance warranties are there for a reason, so that you can monitor the performance over time and make sure it's doing what it should do. Obviously, like with anything you're buying, you should look at the proposed technologies in detail, you know, the warranties, the efficiencies, all that stuff that we mentioned. The assessment of the grid connection is very important. Like, there's no point in getting a proposal there for a 62 kilowatt system, which in theory is the maximum that you can buy under TAMS, if the farm only has a single phase supply and might only be able to connect 17 kVA inverter. The whole thing falls apart then. So really, like at the point of designing the system, that grid connection, MIC and so on should be looked at. Backup service is obviously important in terms of, you know, follow-up in case of any issues in that. I suppose it's hard to know who's performing well or otherwise in that space for now. But, you know, there are some established companies there that have a good track record. So, you know, you'd be probably leaning towards them, or you know, word of mouth and so on is beneficial there as well. And the ability to monitor the performance of the system over time is critical. And to be fair, most of the inverters that are on sale, they come with that ability to keep track of generation over time. So just to sum up now, before we open it up for questions, I suppose, look, what we've seen is, due to the changes in planning, export tariffs, grid connections and grant supports, there's huge developments in this space over the last 18 months. And all these things have improved the opportunities for using solar on dairy farms. The TAMS grant in particular is a sort of a paradigm shift really in terms of the payback periods. Obviously, we've seen it has a big effect. And really, I suppose we want to get across the point that site-specific solutions should be developed for your farm with the generation support, etc., prior to purchase. So I'll leave it at that, folks, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, John and Kevin. We just have a couple questions in the Q&A box. I think you should probably be able to see them, but I can call them out to you there. So I think the first one is probably directed towards John. John, what tariff can be got if selling to the grid approximately?
Yeah, so your tariffs there are ranging between 14 and 20 cents per unit, okay? And that depends on the electricity supplier. And those tariffs are going to be revised on a continuous basis. I think they're saying roughly every 3 or 4 months. So you will be paid in those kind of increments then as well. Okay.
Yep, great. So the second question I have for you as well, John, if you have single phase electricity with an MIC of 16, what size system can you install? So it's quite specific.
Yeah. So right, if you have an MIC of 16, the maximum inverter size you could connect to the grid would be 16. Now you could oversize the panel array a little bit, so you could probably comfortably go to 20 kilowatt peak of panels with the 16 kVA inverter. That would be fairly sensible option.
Okay, there's 3 more questions, 2 of which I'm going to direct at Kevin, but I'm going to just direct the last question that I have towards you for now, John. Can you connect a 30 kW inverter to a 29 MIC limit?
No, you can't do that. So I don't think you can buy a 29 kVA inverter, which is a bit of an issue. So you'd likely end up doing a 25 kVA inverter and then a 30 or 35 kilowatt peak panel system.
Okay, so the final 2 questions that I have here are for Kevin. So Kevin, if you have 2 dwelling houses and a farm on the same meter, can you claim TAMS? And if not, what other grant is available?
I'm not 100% sure about the second dwelling house, but I'd imagine if it's on the same meter, you can, but I'll have to come back to you and double check the second dwelling house. I'm not 100% sure on that.
Okay. And the second question for you, Kevin, a typical suckler type farmer with a house and yard and modest amount of usage, will they be grant aided?
Yeah, any farmer under the TAMS will be grant aided for the solar PV.
And there's another question just after coming in. So a small 20-acre sheep farm in the southwest, I would love to have panels on the ground. I would not use the energy myself, but would want to help lower emissions. Can I still apply through TAMS?
She'd only be permitted to produce the amount of electricity that she's able to use on the farm. So she wouldn't be able to produce microgeneration. Now, let's say she's only allowed spillover. So she'd be creeping into microgeneration if she expects a system bigger than what she actually requires. So that would not, only whatever she's able to use over a 12-month period is what she'll be expected to claim under the TAMS.
John, do you want to come in there? There would be other schemes available that might be suitable for that sort of situation.
I think I suppose we're getting into the limitations of the platform now, but you know, if that farm was connected to the house, you know, there could be 5,000-10,000 kilowatt hours consumed per year, you know, which would be, you know, a substantial enough system, like even though, you know, you might end up exporting half of it, like that person would be able to apply through TAMS for both the farm and the house together. Now, if that wasn't an option, you just go micro generation scheme then. So a single phase farm could do a 6 kVA inverter and an 8 kilowatt solar panel system. Now, if they're on the ground, you'd be limited to 75 meters squared, okay? But that wouldn't be a problem in terms of planning, because an 8 kilowatt system would be well less than 75 meters squared. Houses attached to the farm. So yeah, I think the TAMS would be an option there. 6 kVA inverter and, you know, potentially 8 kilowatt peak, that sort of size.
Super. I think that's there's a few more questions coming in, but I think we're going to wrap it at this for now, and we might put all the questions together actually and do a little bit of a Q&A or frequently asked questions document that we'll be able to circulate afterwards.
Yep.
There was an awful lot covered in a very short space of time there this afternoon, so I want to thank you to John and Kevin for laying it out very comprehensively for us. John and some of the team in Moorpark have compiled a very comprehensive summary document on solar, and we're going to try and make that available through the 4 West Cork co-ops. I'll send the links and a couple copies of it to the co-ops there once the webinar is over. As Kevin mentioned, the next tranche deadline for TAMS is the 16th of June. And I suppose if you are thinking about putting in an application for solar, it would be best to go about doing it sooner rather than later, particularly given that you need to do the survey before you submit your application. So I hope you found this afternoon informative. Thank you again to Kevin Murphy and John Upton for speaking on the webinar this afternoon, and to Grania Hurley and John McNamara in Teagasc for helping us to get this webinar up and running this afternoon. So we leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone. Bye now.
Thanks, Eva. Good luck.